All right, so today we'll be covering the CAR section, aka the critical analysis and reasoning skills section of the MCAT. But before we dive right into the test itself, I'm going to ask you about some interesting examples and questions. So here's the first example, and the question is, this news headline, do you think it's biased? Do you think it's biased? Do you think there's anything biased with this news headline? So the headline is Liberal Cities Murder Surge Fueled by Senseless Killings Over Petty Insults. And it's getting worse. Does anything about this headline seem biased? Not sure. Okay, so let's talk about what bias is, right? So when we talk about bias, we talk about opinions, right? Like um if you say this is a bag of chips, right? It's just a fact. It's a bag of chips. But if you said this is a delicious bag of chips, right? You've injected some of your opinion into it, right? So do you think this sentence has any opinion in it? Is it opinionated in any way? Is it trying to drive any kind of narrative? Is it trying to, does it have a slant to it? Is it a purely neutral fact, or does it have a little bit of bias in it? Petty insults is good, is an example of a phrasing that has some bias in it, right? Senseless killings, right? The adjectives that they're picking have some bias in it, right? If you choose the word senseless killings over senseless killings, or could be violent killings, or could be tragic killings, right? These are different adjectives, have different meanings and different connotations, right? Also, the fact this is Fox News, right? Fox News is a Republican or right-leaning news media organization, right? And in the beginning, they say liberal cities, right? So they're attacking the left. They're attacking their political opponents and saying these guys are having a murder surge. So this is an example of strong bias, right? They have an agenda. They have a narrative that they're trying to push. Now, let's look at another example. This is from the Washington Post, which is basically like a left-leaning news media. And this headline says, anti-vaccine activists gather in DC, a city that mandates COVID vaccines, to protest mandates. Now, what do we think here? Is this more factual than the previous one, less factual than the previous one? Or is there any bias in this headline either? It seems pretty factual, right? Anti-vaccine activists gather in DC. Okay, that's a thing that happened. A city that mandates COVID vaccines. That's also a thing that, assuming it's all true, that seems factual. To protest mandates. Okay, that all seems above board, right? Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate and say that this headline is full of bias. And when I say that, I'm saying that you're not wrong, that this seems very factual, right? This is rooted in facts. But what you're going to learn is when it comes to analyzing text and the author behind a text that seems factual always has some part of the author shining through. So what if I had said, instead of anti-vaccine activists, what if I had said anti-vaccine rioters or anti-vaccine radicals or something revolutionaries? The word choice that I've selected is, yes, biased, right? But here's the point that I'm trying to make. The fact that they have chosen the word activists is also a bias. It's a neutral bias. They chose not to use those extreme words. So this is kind of an interesting thing to wrap your head around. If you say if you choose an extreme word, choosing an extreme word is bias that you're showing to the world, right? But if you actively choose not to pick an extreme word and you stay neutral, this is so when I say bias, I mean like opinion, right? So you can have the opinion to choose an extreme view, or you can have the opinion to have a neutral view. So what I'm trying to get at is that even if something seems like it has no outright bias, the lack of outright bias is showing neutrality, right? And neutrality is also information about the person that wrote this, right? So does that make sense? Because they didn't pick bias, it tells you that they're not biased, or it tells you that they have a neutral bias. And that's also valuable information. And we're going to understand why that's valuable when it comes to breaking down a CARS passage and why you want to do this. So how about this? Now this is a scientific paper, right? And this is just a scientific headline. And this is like, would there be any bias here? Well, in science, there can be bias in terms of like how they perform the experiment, how they select their participants or subjects or whatnot. But in this case, this is kind of a straight fact. They do say effective and safe, right? But in terms of the reason that I have this here is because for you to understand that in CARS, we are not looking at scientific passages. So in the other sections of the exam, we would be looking at scientific passages. In this case, we're not looking at scientific passages, and we're looking more at like narrative style passages or author excerpts from like a text, from not from a textbook, but from a literature kind of book or a journal. So this is not what you would expect to see. So here I have another, maybe a little bit more blatant example of bias, right? So on the left, we have a picture and the caption. These are both from the exact same news channel. This convicted felon is the second man to be arrested in the vandalism of the Metro Courthouse during Saturday's riots. Okay, that's on the left. Then on the right, 25-year-old Wesley Somers was arrested on charges of felony arson, vandalism, and disorderly conduct for setting fire to Nashville's historic courthouse. Do you guys see any bias between these two? What's different between these two? They both are very similar crimes. What's different between how they're reporting these crimes? Right. Yes, right? What effect do you think that has? On the left, convicted felon. On the right, age and name. What effect do you think that would have if you were reading these two articles? I think for the average person, right? If you show them a picture, yeah, exactly. Because the left person is not humanized, right? The left person is a convicted felon. They're an identity, right? They're not a person. They are this thing. They're a felon, right? Whereas the right, it's 25-year-old Wesley Somers, right? Doesn't say anything about him being a criminal, but he was arrested on charges, right? So the way that we describe things is very powerful, even though the situations are almost very, very, very similar, right? The way that we portray things can totally change the understanding of a story, right? And also tells you a little bit about who's writing the story, right? What they think, right? If I saw these two things, I would assume, the person on the left is more prejudiced than the person on the right in terms of the author, right? In terms of who's writing, or the person on the left is more anti-criminal than the person on the right. These are some assumptions, some interpretations that you can make based on what they have written, right? Another thing I'll point out, we have during Saturday's riots versus setting fire, right? So riots are again a very charged word, especially in this time that this happened. There was riots going on in the country, and it was a very charged word. People were very against riots, right? So I just think that the word choices here, when we start paying attention to word choices, you're going to see why they're so important and why they make such a difference. So that was just an exercise to kind of put you in the right headspace before we dive into what CARS is all about. Okay, so now in terms of the actual MCAT, CARS is the critical analysis and reading skills section of the MCAT, and this one is unique because you don't have to study for it. You do have to practice, but you don't have to study for it. You don't have to memorize anything. There's nothing to learn, right? There's not nothing to learn. There's nothing to memorize. There's no content to be aware of. But you do have to kind of learn a different way of reading, which is what we're going to get into. So in CARS, you do three things. You read a passage, you interpret the passage, and then you answer the questions. So reading the passage, interpreting the passage, and answering the questions are all like kind of three separate skills. So we're going to work on those three separate skills. There's going to be 9 passages, 5 to 7 questions per passage, and you get 53 questions overall, which is less than the other sections. The other sections have 59. So that's the anatomy of it, right? And now what is the point of this thing, right? People are pretty surprised that there's a section on this test that seems to have nothing to do with science or anything, right? You would expect a test for going into medical school would be chock full of science. So what is this passage here? What is this section doing here on the MCAT? Well, understanding how to critically think is really, really important because you're going to be using critical thinking all the time as a physician. For example, if you see certain symptoms, right, you have to kind of piece together the puzzle based on those clues and think, oh, this could be this, or this could be this, this could be this, right? You have evidence, pieces of evidence that you need to synthesize into a diagnosis as a physician, right? And in a very similar way, CARS does a similar and analogous process, right? What you're doing is when you read the passage, right, you're trying to fish out your interpretation of who wrote this passage. Who is the writer behind this passage? And that's why we did the exercise with the bias. So we're trying to understand who wrote this passage and what do they believe, right? When we normally read, we don't do this. When we normally read, we're just reading for either for pleasure or for information, right? If you're reading, some story online, then you're probably just reading to know about what happened, right? Just for the information. If you're reading a good book, you're probably just reading to enjoy the book, right? When it comes to CARS, we are reading for the purpose of information gathering. We're reading to understand who wrote the passage. We're reading to answer questions. So it's very different. Normally, if you get a textbook in class, right? Let's say you get a textbook in class. Have you ever looked up who wrote that textbook? Did you ever take the time to be I wonder, I don't know if I trust whoever this person is that wrote the textbook. I'm going to look them up and figure out if this textbook is legit. I don't think anybody does that, right? I think most of us just accept that we just trust that the textbook is verified information by our professor, and we just accept that information, right? When it comes to CARS, we're much more stringent about questioning the author, questioning their mentality, questioning their judgment, questioning their opinions. So this is how I think it influences the what I think the relevance is overall. Okay, so there's a show on Netflix called Mindhunter that I really like. And it's basically about these FBI agents who were the first people to kind of create the concept of a serial killer and understand they were the first people to kind of engage with behavioral psychology and finding out why criminals do what they do, right? Like the extreme criminals. So in this case, the cool thing is you're kind of doing something similar when you read a Cars passage. Instead of using, so imagine that there's been a crime, right? And the only piece of evidence left is a paper that the criminal wrote when they were in college, right? That's the only piece of evidence that we have available to us. And the FBI comes to you and says, read this paper and tell me everything that you can about the author. So the paper itself is not about the author, right? The paper is about something the author was writing about, some kind of topic, right? However, from their word choice, from their ideas, we can piece together a profile of who's writing the passage. And that's really, really important. That's what is going to help you a lot when it comes to the section of the MCAT. So we're going to use the passage to discover the opinions of the author, right? Sometimes the author will tell you straight up when he's writing, this is what I believe. Other times he won't be so direct, and there will be just some clues, some pieces of the text that will help you to, once you pick up on all those clues, you can synthesize the fact that, okay, from this, and this, we can tell that the author overall believes this. So so this is going to make more sense when we do an actual passage, and we're going to do an actual passage. But some things that can help you with that are stuff like the word choice, like we talked about. There are words that mean very similar things, but just have different connotations. If you say I modified the plan versus I manipulated the plan, right? One sounds much worse than the other. One has a neutral bias, one has a neutral connotation, whereas the other one has a negative connotation, right? Or sneakiness to it. There's also the fact that when you're reading through a passage, right? The whole time you're reading through a passage and you're trying to understand, what is this author trying to say? What are they trying to tell me, right? What do they believe? When you're reading that and you're picking up on things little by little by little, and then all of a sudden you hit although, or however, or but instead, or something like that, right? That tells you, oh, the author's going in a different direction. What they were just talking about is not their opinion. It was just a setup, right? Now that they're saying although, that means they're kind of swerving and choosing to talk about something different. So these are some things that we're going to see. Now, when we talk about for Cars prep, it's it's a little tricky because you can't study for it, right? So what can you use to study for Cars, right? Ultimately, the people who make the test have the best material, right? The AMC. So the AMC has these question packs and this diagnostic tool, and those are kind of like the best resource that you can use for preparing for Cars. Now, as I told you, Khan Academy material was made in conjunction with the AMC, so it's the next best thing. UWorld, obviously being a premium product, has good material, but again, because you can't study for Cars, like the material is, the passages are trying to emulate the AMC formula rather than being the AMC formula, right? So a lot of people will try to like leave this material for last, right? Leave the AMC Cars material for last because it's the best material. I would argue that that's kind of difficult because you might pick up bad habits from like third-party resources that you're trying to work on, right? Like maybe you use some strategies that work for those, but then end up not working with the AMC. So overall, I would say like to focus on the AMC's own resources, as well as Khan Academy's resources if you need more cars practice, which we're going to be using today. And I'll show you that on Khan Academy, they have the passages and they have the questions, but they're not in the MCAT format, right? So you can use this website to see it in the MCAT format, and I'm going to show you that at the end here. Okay, so we talked a lot about, overall what the section is about, but what kind of questions do you get? Okay, so let's talk about the questions. There's three major types of questions. And the first one is called Foundations of Comprehension. Foundations of Comprehension questions are for you to understand the central themes and ideas about the passage. So this is what I call a level 1 question, right? It is simply, did you understand what you read? Did you understand what the author is saying? What the author argued? Without any other, tricks thrown in, do you understand the passage on its own, right? So you would usually see questions like, what is the main idea of the passage? Or what does the author think about the main idea of the passage, right? These are just straight up asking you, hey, do you get it? And this comprises 30% of questions. Then next, we would see something called reasoning within the text. So reasoning within the text is you have the previous, they kind of build, right? So before it was simply, do you understand the author's argument, right? Now the question is, do you understand the author's argument enough to evaluate it? So what do I mean by evaluate it? That means that, you understand the author's argument, but then you compare it to other things in that text, right? Like, can you understand how good the author's argument is, or how convincing it is, and kind of like just a step further than just I understand, but rather I can critique or I can engage with the author's argument, right? So the typical kind of questions that you might see are, which of these sentences is unrelated to the author's argument? So you see, that's a little bit more. That requires you to know, oh, I know that this is the author's argument, and then I know that, oh, this sentence would be unrelated, right? Or they could ask you, which of these quotes from the passage did the author use to support their claim or their argument? And these comprise 30% of the questions. Now, lastly, we have reasoning beyond the text. So reasoning beyond the text is a level 3 kind of question. So a level 3 question is, did you understand the author's argument enough that we can give you some new information and you can compare to that? So this would typically be something like, if the author is talking about mowing grass or something, right? And he's talking about like, oh, mowing grass is like really fun, it's a great hobby or whatever, right? And then the question asks something about, how would the author feel about growing trees, right? So this is kind of something that seems like it's out of nowhere, right? But if you look at the similarities between what was discussed in the passage and what could relate to growing trees, you would be able to kind of make it an inference of what the author thinks about that new idea. So reasoning beyond the text is pretty clear when it's a reasoning beyond the text question, because you'll be able to see that they're introducing some new information that wasn't in the text. And this actually consists of 40% of questions. So something like, which position would the author most disagree with, right? Because they're introducing some new positions that you have to evaluate compared to the passage. So these are the three major types of CARS questions that you can get. Okay. So before we get into actually practicing, any questions about about the actual format of cars so far. So we talked about profiling the author, talked about, you know, looking for what the author believes, and then tackling these questions. Okay, so let's start doing some practice. So first, I'm going to give you a basic outline of how you can practice and how you can improve, right? You're going to keep a journal. That's going to be like your car's journal. And you like obviously you can't make flashcards when you get something wrong in cars, right? So what you can instead do is keep a journal. And that's going to be kind of a almost like a logic journal. You're going to be tracking how you think about these questions. So what I did was I did the passage under like testing conditions. So what does testing condition means? I took it as though I was, taking it for a test. I would read the passage through. I would read the passage through, and then I would answer the questions. And I would, mark down how much time did I take to do that passage, just for my own records. Then I would answer the questions, right? So I'm answering the questions, and I'm not checking the answers. I'm doing it like it's testing conditions. I'm doing my answers, my questions. After I'm done with the passage, right? I now need to go deeper into what are we actually, how can I actually improve if I get something wrong? So in order to improve, right, you need to commit your thoughts into writing. Why do you need to commit your thoughts into writing? Because first off, right, the major thing that you need to write down is the main idea. And you need to be very simple about it. Oftentimes I ask people like, tell me what is the main idea of this passage, and they will kind of try to encompass the whole passage and like go on for 3 or 4 sentences, which is very natural, right? Like you're reading through the passage and you're trying to find the main idea and you're kind of just saying whatever you see, right? But the main idea is usually not going to just be right in the passage. You're not going to be able to find it just by reading through. The main idea is going to be something that you're going to synthesize as you read through the passage. And I think the 2 key elements of a main idea for cars is what I call the what and the how. The what is basically what the passage is about, right? So you can consider it like half of the comprehension, right? What are we talking about? We're talking about grass or trees or schools or whatever. Like, what are we talking about? Fundamental. But then the more important part, right, is how does the author feel about it? If you can extract those 2 pieces correctly, you can get all of the comprehension correction questions correct. You can get most of the reasoning within the text correction questions correct. And the reason beyond the text, depending on what the scenario is. But that is the key, and it's much harder than it sounds, right? It seems simple. Oh, what is it about, and how do they feel about it? The how do they feel about it takes a lot of practice and a lot of careful attention to detail, picking up on those clues, picking up on clues. So when you do that, right, you want to write it down. You want to write it down because you need to have something to compare to later. You're going to write down, okay, I think this is what it's about, and how the author feels about it is probably like this, right? Then you're going to go through all of your answers, right? For the questions, right? When you go through the questions, if you decided on choice A, you'll write down, I think choice A is correct because blah, 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 blah. Now, for the other options, you need to write, I think this option is wrong because blah, 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 blah. The reason you have to do this is because that's how you keep yourself accountable. Because when you go to look at the answer choices and you read the answer choices, it's very easy psychologically. It's very easy to kind of trick yourself and say, "Oh yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I was kind of considering that. Oh yeah, I would have picked that if I thought about it a little bit more." Right? It's very easy to trick yourself like that. You don't want to trick yourself. You want to be honest with yourself. This is a process of. I feel like this section requires the most introspection and the most like humbleness in a way, because you really have to be open to being wrong and open to understanding why you're wrong and open to doing a little bit better next time and understanding, oh okay, I got this wrong because I overlooked this. Next time I'm not going to do that. This process, I feel like this section, again, remember this section is the lowest scoring section on average because you cannot improve on it just by studying content, and you really have to go through this process, and there's really no shortcuts to this process of slowly improving over time and working on your logical skills. So once you've written down all that stuff, you can check your questions compared to the answer key, and now you can start comparing. You have a great opportunity because if you got something wrong, you wrote down why the right answer is wrong, right? And that's a great opportunity for you to dig into, like, well, I thought this was wrong. So let me see why do they say it's right? And let me see what was wrong with my logic. Those moments of what was wrong with my logic is how you study for cars. That's it. You can't study content. You can't study anything else. You have to study your wrong answers. Because your wrong answer, everybody gets different wrong answers, right? Your wrong answers reflect your own thinking processes and your own engagement with the text. So only you can go through that and resolve those, maybe logical assumptions or logical leaps, or going overextending your logic, or something like that. You will start to notice patterns. You will start to notice, I'm getting the comprehension questions wrong. Maybe I don't understand the passage when I read it. Or maybe you're getting the reasoning beyond the text questions wrong because the novel scenarios are confusing you and you don't see how they relate. Either way, you're going to start seeing patterns. And when you start seeing those patterns, it tells you kind of how you can improve. So any questions on how to practice? We are going to actually do a passage right now, and we're going to see this in action, and we're going to understand, and you guys are also going to do it, right? Active learning, we talked about active learning, right? Active learning is the best way. We're going to read a passage together, and for now, you're just going to read the passage through, and then we're going to talk about what we got from that passage, right? Because everybody has a different way of reading and understanding. And we're going to talk about how we can convert whatever you're doing right now to read, how we can convert that into something that's effective for the MCAT. So, but before we dive into the actual practice, does anybody have any questions about practicing for cars or scheduling or anything? Okay, then we'll get straight into our practice. So let's see here. All right, so I'm putting a link in the chat. And so this is the Khan Academy cars material, but it's on this site, and this site is cool because it gives you the ability to do the passages in the MCAT format. So that's really nice, I think. So does that link work for everybody? I think if you try to answer the questions, you need to sign up, and you can do that later on. But for now, what I want everybody to do is read through this passage. reading through the passage. So let me just, so I'm going to read through the passage as well. I want everybody to read through their passage, and then we're going to kind of compare and contrast, right? So let's just give, like 10 minutes or so for everybody to truly read through. And I want you to focus on what and how. What is the passage about? How does the author feel? You can, kind of type it up, and then we'll compare what everybody's answers, right? And I think that's a good starting point. Okay, so everybody can. So this is a passage about physical education. Uh, let's read it. Okay. Did everybody have a chance to read through the passage? Okay, cool. Does anybody need more time? All right, so let's get into it. So this passage, right? What and how? What is the passage about, and how does the author feel about it? So this is basically what you would be doing when you're practicing, right? Right now, we're going to write down a 1 or 2 sentence, what and how, for you to put down as this is my interpretation of the passage, right?
I guess I'll go first if that's okay.
Sure.
So when I read this passage, what I thought this passage was about is how PE is not a necessary requirement for schools because number one, PE is expensive. So it's really a waste of time and money for schools. And within perhaps why the author wrote this, maybe he had a bad experience when he was younger in physical activity. So maybe that is why he has resulted to saying that PE is not even worth doing in schools anymore.
Awesome. So there's a lot of good and a lot of fluff. So because when you here's what you can improve there, and here's what's really good about that. What's really good is that you've captured what the passage is about, right? And how the author feels about it. What's not helpful to you is the trying to pull elements from the entire passage, like why he feels this way or the reasons that he feels this way. And the reason that it's not helpful is because when you're analyzing these questions, you want to have a very, very simple prototype of what the author feels, right? So you did a good job breaking down this passage. When you're actually writing down, like, this is what I think the main idea is, it should be very short and succinct. So just the first part of what you said is good enough, right? The first part of what you said, I believe, was, the author uh, does not believe that PE classes should be mandatory, right? That's basically, that's the what and the how the author feels about it, right? The what is, should PE classes be mandatory, right? How does the author feel? I don't believe that PE class should be mandatory. Ultimately, we have distilled this whole passage down into a sentence. You have to get really good at this. This is half of the battle. Half of the battle is being very, very succinct and saying, I really, really understand what this passage is all about. I really understand what they're telling me enough that I can make it short and sweet, right? Short and sweet. So that's essentially what we want to break it down into. Now, another thing I'm going to talk about is when we go through the passage, right? Did anybody highlight the passage? I forgot to tell you guys that there is on the test, right? On the actual MCAT, you can highlight, right? And I think when people read textbooks and stuff, they highlight all sorts of things, right? They highlight facts, they highlight names, they highlight this and that, right? When it comes to highlighting, I have a slightly different approach for cars. For highlighting, I only highlight clues to the author. Why? Because, if I want a fact, I'll be able to find the fact just by skimming, right? The fact is there, right? If maybe it was something about I don't know, I remember he said something about liability, right? Something about legal problems. Boom. Increasingly litigious age, a compulsory rather than voluntary sports program is a liability. That's easy to find, relative, right? What is it relatively easy to find compared to? It's much harder to find how does the author believe, what does the author feel about this, right? it's not all the time that they're going to just put it right in the passage. So in my case, I would highlight anything that where he says, this is what I think, or is a clue to what he thinks. So in this passage, he made it easy. In this passage, he straight up told you, I believe that students should be allowed a choice. Boom, you highlight this. You highlight this. This is the author straight up telling you, right? This is very, very important. What else can we highlight? PE class is different from other classes because it involves what one does with one's body, right? The right of individuals to control their own bodies. Why is this any different? This really tells us that the author cares about the right of individuals to control their own bodies, right? And this is linked to students having a choice to participate in PE or not, right? There are more effective ways of ensuring a healthy population. So anything that, especially remember, we talked about word choice. We talked about, the difference between I manipulated the plan versus I modified the plan. A strong word choice is something you want to highlight. Strong word choice tells you the author really feels a certain way about it, right? So for example, furthermore, sports are a waste of school time and resources. That's a strong statement, right? He didn't say it's a misallocation of resources. He didn't say it could be better used. He said it's a waste. It is useless, right? A waste of school time. That really tells you he hates it, right? It doesn't tell you that it's not that like he could take it or leave it. He's saying he's against it, right? He's fully against sports in schools, right? So from his perspective, right? So this stuff like this, like picking up on how the choices that he said, the classes may even be dangerous, right? He's really like throwing shade on the idea of PE in schools, right? So these are kind of the things that I feel like are more useful to highlight than facts, because when you're skimming for facts, you'll be able to find the facts. But when you're skimming for the author's opinion, you wouldn't necessarily be able to find the opinion straight up. So, any questions about, the getting this main idea, the what and the how, before we dive into the questions? Does everything make sense so far? Okay, cool. So now let's dive into our first question. The first question is, what is the function of the statement in the first paragraph that PE class is different from other classes? So no, we didn't have to highlight this, right? Whenever a cars question asks you stuff, they will kind of direct you to where they're looking at, because again, they're not making you go on a scavenger hunt. You probably remember like the old ELA state English exams where sometimes you have to like go looking for something, but that's not their goal. They just want you to tell them about the author. So the function of the statement in the first paragraph that PE class is different from other classes. So PE class is different from other classes because it involves what one does with one's body, right? Now, when we look at these answer choices, right, you're going to evaluate every answer choice based on this main idea that you made. And that's how you can get through this in an efficient way. Because this main idea and this answer choice always need to flow together. They cannot contradict each other. If they contradict each other, it's incorrect, right? So this answer choice says it's part of an argument why PE classes should be required. Does this line up with our passage and the author's message? No, not at all, right? This is actually outright contradictory. Outright contradictory, right? So this is very clearly a wrong answer choice, right? And now we have B. It is part of an argument that PE classes improve people's health. Does this line up with what the author is saying? Again, no, right? C. It explains why students should only be exempt from PE with parental permission. Did the author argue that students should only be exempt from PE with parental permission? No, he didn't, right? And this actually, if we dig in a little deeper, we can even think about why this is contradictory. Even the author didn't make this argument, but why is this contradictory? Students should only be exempt from PE with parental permission. This is a little bit more deeper, right? And this is really critical thinking. Why does this contradict, this sentence? PE class is different from other classes because it involves what one does with one's body. Do you guys see any contradiction there? Exactly. The parents control the child's body, right? But that's not what the author is saying. This choice is saying the PE, you can be exempt with parental permission. But the author has already expressed a strong right of individuals to control their own bodies, right? So this is kind of this is one of the this is like kind of obvious, but sometimes this style of answer choice can be very, very sneaky because they've included exempt from PE. And you're like, oh yeah, exempt from PE, that's kind of what he's talking about. But then at the end, boom, they throw in something that's wrong. They throw in something that's outright contradictory. So it explains why students should be only exempt from PE. Up to that point, this is fine with parental permission. Oh, it's wrong now. It's wrong because it contradicts the main idea, right? So good job catching that. They try to confuse you in a subtle way, and you have to be one step ahead of them. So obviously, process of elimination, we're left with this one. It explains why students should have a choice about whether to take PE while not having a choice about taking other compulsory classes, right? So if we try to evaluate, let's just, when you're doing your own practice, right? In this case, if this was a test, right? You would just choose D and move because you know the others are wrong. But this is practice, right? So we want to not only select D, but we want to truly explain why we think that D is the correct answer on its own merits, right? Not just because of elimination. So on its own merits, they're saying students should have a choice about whether to take PE. Okay, that's all good. While not having a choice about taking other compulsory classes. Okay, did the author say anything about that? Did he say that, students don't get to have a choice about taking compulsory classes? And he says PE class is different from other classes because it involves what one does with one's body. Okay, this is good, right? This is a pretty logical, clear relationship. He's saying PE classes are different because only in PE is your bodily autonomy kind of being taken away from you. In other classes, you're not being forced to move around or anything like that. So this logically makes sense, and we can click here and check our answer. Well, actually, we wouldn't check our answer if we're doing it like okay. So we won't check our answer now because when we're doing it, I suggest that you don't check your answer. I suggest that you just take the passage as if you're taking the passage, right? And then check your answers at the end. How long should one spend deciphering a passage? How long should we take per question when it comes to cars? Great question, right? And we're going to talk about timing because timing is one of the other major concerns. When it comes to deciphering a passage, if you spend, some passages will take you 3 minutes. Some passages will take you 4 minutes. Some passages will take you 5 minutes. The point is that you need to spend enough time that once you understand the passage, you have the main idea and it's correct, right? What you don't want to do is kind of go through the passage and be like, I have no idea what I just read. I'm going to look at the questions and maybe that'll help me. The question will just make you more confused. And then you're going to go back to the passage. You're going to try to reread it. And then you're going to be more confused. The point is to read the passage and come to that main idea. And once you have that main idea, you're not digging through the passage for the main idea. You're just referencing the passage to look at the quotes or whatever they're directing to you. But you kind of need to put in the good chunk of time to extract that main idea successfully and then move on to the questions. Now, when you're on the questions, I would personally say that so what we saw here is there's two choices, and again, I think we covered this pattern before, but again, there's two choices that are kind of blatantly wrong because they blatantly contradict, right? Two choices that are blatant contradictions and are wrong, and you just immediately eliminate them as soon as you read them, right? Then you get a more subtle choice between an answer that's pretty good but slightly wrong and an answer that's like kind of weird looking but overall has nothing wrong with it. That whole process of knock out two and then spend a little bit of time between two questions ultimately shouldn't take you more than a minute. Now, if you get stuck and the question is bothering you and you're stuck on it for more than a minute, you need to flag it and move on. You need to just flag it and move on. Otherwise, you're going to get caught in a vicious like overthinking cycle. You just need to flag it, move on, and come back to it with a little bit more with a fresh set of eyes, basically. Because you can really get lost in the weeds trying to figure out the nuance and the subtleties. So that's like a rough idea of timing, but we're going to talk a little bit more about timing after this. Okay, so that one is, oh, I didn't want to erase the main idea, but okay, that's fine. So that's our first question, and we're going to move on to the next one. Okay, so the next one. Which of the following assumptions is made by the author in relation to the argument about students' hectic schedules? So again, the keyword here is hectic schedules. Let's see if we can find that keyword in our passage, just to have a reference point, right? Budgets. Right here. Our children are burdened enough in schools already, especially at the older end of the system with multiple examinations. PE simply adds needlessly to this hectic schedule. So now we have to evaluate each of these choices, right? Which of the following assumptions made by the author in relation to the argument about the students' hectic schedules? A, PE tends not to have a final examination. Now, when we look at this passage, right, it doesn't mention anything about a final examination, right? So we're kind of like, we know that we can probably assume that to be true, right? PE tends not to have a final examination, but is it the author's assumption, right? This is another very important point. When you're reading the stuff, you need to separate yourself from the author. You can make an assumption. You think, oh yeah, that makes sense. But did the author make that assumption? You never know. Some of these authors are pretty out there. Some of them are making assumptions that are like not in our modern context, right? Like if you're reading an author from the 1900s or something, they may have a different point of view, right? And the test is really testing you to see, can you successfully remove your POV and embrace their POV, right? So we have to verify, does that make sense? So the best way to do this is again, refer to that main idea, right? So the main idea was the author does not think PE should be mandatory, right? There should be a choice, right? So, okay. And here, this choice is saying PE tends not to have a final examination. And he's saying in this passage, PE simply adds needlessly to this hectic schedule. So now let's think about it. Does it flow, right? The author is saying PE adds to the schedule. The choice is saying PE tends not to have a final exam. If PE tends not to have a final exam, does it add to the hectic schedule? If PE doesn't have a final exam, then it would not be contributing to the hectic schedule, right? Or it's a point against his point, right? If somebody was saying, if this was a debate, right? And he says, PE adds to the hectic schedule of students. We shouldn't have PE. And somebody said in response, oh, well, PE doesn't have a final exam. Are they arguing against them or are they arguing with them? If you say, oh, PE doesn't have a final exam, when somebody's saying PE adds to the schedule, right? Then they're arguing against them, right? They're saying, oh, there's no final exam in PE, so why would it have why would kids have a problem with their exams? There is no exam for PE. So this is contradictory, right? And so that's what I mean by looking at does something flow, right? The author's argument here is PE adds to the schedule, but the idea of PE not having a final exam, does not flow with his assertion here. Does that make sense? That makes okay, good. So when you so it makes more sense if you relate it back to the author's point, right? Either the main idea or the very specific part that the passage is asking you to look at. So now if you look at the second part, the second choice, it will make the same sense, right? PE simply adds needlessly to the tactic schedule. PE tends not to have a heavy homework burden. Contradictory or not contradictory? Contradictory, right? It's the same logic as the first one. PE tends not to have a final exam. Oh, okay, so it's not a burden. PE tends not to have homework. Oh, okay, so it's not a burden. So then it's not adding to the hectic schedule. So then this is wrong, right? Now, so we've basically eliminated the two easy ones. Now we have a choice between slightly harder questions. So we're going to look at these, right? And oftentimes when I'm left with the two that I know are the harder ones, I won't eliminate anything right away. I will read both of them first just to kind of get acclimated to them. That's just what I like to do. C, compulsory PE, if eliminated, would not be replaced by another compulsory course. Okay. D, it is unfair to require students in the higher grades to prepare for multiple examinations. Okay. So now, looking at our choice, right? Our passage, he says, our children are burdened enough in schools already, especially at the older end of the system with multiple exams. PE simply adds needlessly to this hectic schedule. Now, between these two options, which of these flows better with the main idea? Which of this flows better with the main idea? D, it is unfair to require students in the higher grades to prepare for multiple exams. So here, the author says, the children are burdened with multiple exams, right? And PE simply adds needlessly to the schedule. So he is saying that multiple exams are burdening our students. Multiple exams are burdening our students, right? He says that. Now, let's look at choice C. Compulsory PE, if eliminated, would not be replaced by another compulsory. Okay, so I'm wondering how to best break this down. So I want somebody to explain why D is the answer, either in the chat or on voice or anything. I was saying I would like somebody to explain why D is the answer choice. Basically, why do you think D is the correct answer?
I don't. I mean, like it's coming right from the passage where it says that. Oh my gosh, it's like a lot of noise in my
That's okay. That's okay. We can hear you. So sorry, you were saying that there's a lot of evidence. It says right there in the passage, right?
Yeah.
Right. He said students at the older end, as in higher grades, have multiple exams. Perfect. Okay, good. D is not the correct answer choice. And this is again the subtlety. The same thing that we saw in the last question is happening again here, but much, much more subtle here. And that's why you guys don't see it this time. The reason that this is not correct is because to require students in the higher grades to prepare for multiple exams. This is all what he said. It is unfair. It is unfair. Remember when we talked about the power of certain word choices? Remember that we talked about how, if he had said, did he say that it's unfair that students are taking exams, right? That would actually be kind of against academics. But this author had a strong desire for academics, right? He even said, better spent on academics, right? He was arguing for academics. So would he say that it's unfair to require students to prepare for exams? He's not actually saying it's unfair. He's saying that PE needlessly adds to the hectic schedule, but hectic schedule doesn't mean unfair schedule, right? So yes, that's how they get you. And this is what we're talking about with assumptions, right? When you see hectic schedule and you're like, oh, I was a student, man, that really sucked. Like being a student, oh God, it was so unfair. You don't even know it, but you've made an association, right? And this is the thing, right? This is going to happen to a lot. You are going to be so confident in an answer, you're going to choose it and it's going to be wrong. And it hurts. Like humans all have egos, right? We all have egos, right? And it does feel bad when you thought you knew something and it was wrong, right? But the powerful thing about this is the way that I kind of flipped, the way that I kind of broke out of that feeling was that I I started seeing as like I'm so thankful when I get an answer choice wrong because I'm getting it wrong during practice. And if I get it wrong during practice, I'll get it right on the exam. That's kind of the mentality that I had. I was like, I got it wrong now so that I can get it right in the future. And that's good. That's a good thing, right? And I started almost seeing it like if I got a question right, then it was like a waste of time because I didn't learn anything from the question, right? So if you kind of you have to eventually adjust your mindset from like, oh, I'm taking an L to like, oh, good, I took an L here. What can I learn? The L stands for learning, as cheesy as that sounds. The L is not for loss. The L is for learning. So you're gonna learn something from every answer that you get wrong. So it's for learning, yes. So oh, that's funny. So anywho, so you guys see the subtlety, right? Like this is the key. This is like if there's one thing that you learn about cars, it's how subtle. There's two answer choices that are blatantly wrong and one choice that is subtly wrong. And the subtly wrong choice, now there are ways to work around it. There are ways to not I know that D is wrong even without digging into the fact this unfair word choice. And I'll explain to you why I know D is wrong. The reason I know D is wrong is because it has nothing to do with the main idea. Notice this. It is unfair to require students in the higher grades to prepare for multiple examinations. What was the main idea? The author does not think PE should be mandatory. What does this main idea have to do with exams? Nothing. Nothing. It's not related at all. So remember, the answer choice always needs to flow with your main idea that you've created, right? So if your main idea is succinct, compact, it's always going to lead you at least in the direction of what you should consider more as the correct answer, rather than if it's completely unrelated. And I totally understand why you guys chose it, because it does just say it blatantly here, but they know what they're doing. They know kind of how to trick you. And because it says it blatantly there, and because the answer choice seems to match that so well, because unfair is very similar to hectic, boom, it should be D, but it's not D. So now we dig into, and again, when you're doing this on your own, you're going to be writing down, so you would have written down, oh, I think D is correct because that's what they said in the passage. And then when you do the answers, you're going to think about it a little bit more deeply, and you're going to say, oh, okay. Oh, I see where I went wrong here. And yeah. So now let's dig into C, right? Compulsory PE, if eliminated, would not be replaced by another compulsory course. So this is a little bit of a weird one, right? First of all, compulsory PE, if eliminated, okay, that seems to be along the lines of what we're talking about, would not be replaced by another compulsory course. What is that all about? What do they mean by that? Well, the question was saying, which of the following assumptions is made by the author, right, in relation to the argument about students' hectic schedules? So this is a little bit of a logic chain that we need to break down. Number one, the author has made an assumption, right? When we're trying to figure out what that is, right? And here, this answer choice is saying that if we eliminate PE, right? And what did he say in the passage? He says, PE simply adds needlessly to the hectic schedule, right? Where the children are burdened in schools and they're taking multiple exams. So his argument is, right, PE simply adds needlessly to the hectic schedule. So therefore, the argument is, hey, if we eliminate PE, we reduce the burden, the exam burden on students. Less hectic schedule. Does this make sense? Right? I'm basically just outlining his argument, right? I'm just writing it out, right? He says PE simply adds needlessly to the hectic schedule. After this, he could write a sentence. Therefore, if we eliminate PE, we'll reduce the exam burden on students and they'll have a less hectic schedule. I'm just writing out what he didn't write, right? So now we compare this to this assumption, right? He's saying compulsory PE, if eliminated, would not be replaced by another compulsory course. And we see now that this is an assumption that this author is making, because in order for this to be true, the overall number of courses needs to go down. But what if we eliminate PE and it's replaced? Oh, actually, let me do that separately. What if we eliminate PE and it's replaced with another academic course, right? Then are we reducing the exam burden on students? No, we're increasing it. Are we making a less hectic schedule? No, we're making maybe a more or a similar hectic schedule, right? So we can see now by outlining the logic that actually there is this assumption. He is assuming that if you eliminate compulsory PE, there won't be another compulsory course. And if we don't have another compulsory course, then we get what he's talking about. We get the less burden, we get the less hectic schedule. Does that make sense? So this is one where, the logic is a little bit deeper, right? That we have to kind of pull out from the passage. However, I always say choose the least wrong answer, right? A and B are clearly contradictory. D is not flowing with the main idea. Therefore, it seems like C is the correct answer. That's kind of how I would go through it on the fly while doing an exam. And then that kind of logic is very good to go through. Do what I just did with the logic, right? You should do that, right? When you're doing your practice, absolutely write out the logic, because if you make a mistake, then you can confront it on the paper. On the actual exam, you may not have time to write out all of the logic, but you may get to the point where you're kind of doing it in your head, right? The idea is to get to the point where you are going through all of this like real quick. So so this was a good question because it showed you the very standard pitfall that you can end up in. Any questions about this question? A lot of important stuff what happened here. Okay. Okay, good. All right. So let's go and yeah, so this should be I can't resist. I'm just going to check the solution. But yeah. So and the other thing is like once you're checking the solutions, right? They'll tell you you know how to understand the passage, right? So we can read about why D, why C, and why D, right? So the author describes the busy schedule of students and argues for the elimination of PE to help alleviate that burden. This would only be true if PE was not replaced by another compulsory course with a similar amount of work. Option C. The fact that PE tends not to have a final exam and does not have a heavy homework burden suggests that PE might be relatively less likely to cause additional stress for a student relative to another class, which is not part of the author's assumptions. The point about requiring students in the higher grades to prepare for multiple exams is also not addressed or assumed by the author, right? Because unfair to require is not what he was talking about in the passage. Okay. All right, so let's go to our next question. I don't want to delete this. Let's see. Okay, let's go. All right. Okay, so question number 3. Assume as true that students are more likely to obtain specialist coaching at sports clubs outside of school than in school. How would this information be relevant to the passage? And another thing that you can kind of start doing just for you to get used to it is kind of trying to predict what kind of question this is. So this question is, so remember the 3 types of questions that we have are comprehension questions, reading within the reasoning within the text, and reasoning beyond the text. So this one is saying, assume as true that students are more likely to obtain specialist coaching at sports clubs outside of school than in school. How would this information be relevant to the passage? When you see something like this, a new fact, and then relate this to the passage, this is reasoning beyond the text because they're giving you some info beyond the text and they're saying, reason with this information now. So let's actually tackle the question, right? So they're saying specialist coaching outside of school. So we need to kind of find, so again, we have our main idea about PE, right? But this doesn't seem to be directly related to that. Let's try to find what they're talking about here with specialist coaching at sports clubs outside of school. So we're looking for something about, outside of school. Okay, there it is, outside of school, right? So now we can kind of quickly skim this to figure out what the idea is, right? As for the argument that without compulsory PE, many members of society wouldn't find out that they had a talent for a sport or even that they enjoyed it, students can discover that aptitude outside of school without also discovering the bullying and humiliation that comes with PE classes more than other classes, right? So whoever said that the author probably, had a bad experience with PE was probably right, because he seems to be, focused on that. So now they're saying, they're giving us some new information. They're saying students are more likely to obtain specialist coaching at sports clubs outside of school than in school. How does this relevant to the passage? Okay, so we have to go through one by one. It would restate an objection to compulsory physical education classes. Restate an objection to compulsory physical education classes. Now, here, are we restating an objection to compulsory physical education classes? So we know that he is arguing against compulsory physical education classes. That's good, right? He's arguing against compulsory physical education. Yes. Is it restating an objection? And again, when I see a choice like this, I always feel like, because it's like too good, I always feel like, oh, I have to be very careful here. Because compulsory physical education objection to compulsory physical education classes, that's really, really good with what the author is saying, but I need to make sure that this is all correct. So is it restating an objection to that? As for the argument that without compulsory PE, many members of society wouldn't find out that they had a talent for the sport or that they even enjoyed it, students can discover this aptitude outside of school without discovering bullying and humiliation that comes with PE classes more than with other lessons. So this one's a little bit tricky. This is not an objection to compulsory physical education. It's just him arguing against that that initial statement. As for the argument that without compulsory BE, right? So he's referencing an argument. He's saying, as for this argument, right? Some people are saying that without compulsory PE, many members of society wouldn't know that they would have that they want to play a sport, right? But the author is saying, well, they can find out about it outside of school and they won't get bullied or whatever, right? So it's not restating an objection to the PE. It's rather an objection to this argument in particular. The particular argument that many members of society wouldn't find out that they had a talent. So let's look at B. It would support a point about discovering sports aptitude made in rebuttal. And that seems pretty good, because this is a point that he's making in rebuttal to this argument. As for this argument, students can, this is the argument, and this is my rebuttal. Students can discover the aptitude outside of school. And then we find out that it's true. Students are more likely to obtain specialist coaching at sports clubs outside the school. Therefore, it supports the author's point about discovering sports aptitude made in rebuttal. So this B seems pretty correct right now. Let's look at the other ones. It would directly challenge one of the author's claims. It does not directly challenge, right? It actually flows with it. Students can discover the aptitude outside of school. Assume as true that students are more likely to obtain specialist coaching at sports clubs outside of school. That's 100% not contradicted. It would contradict one of the author's examples. Again, it doesn't contradict, right? So we see that C and D are the blatantly wrong. We see that A is a very tricky, subtle wrong, and that B is likely the correct answer, right? So we can take a look. Yeah. And you can even see from the percentages, that so these are the percentages of like other people taking the thing, right? The passage, right? And so you can see from the percentages which are the two hard choices and which are the two easy choices, basically, right? So that's kind of how you can guide yourself. Any questions about this one? All right. So now we have question number 4. The author's central theme for the whole passage is. Now, What kind of question is this? Is this comprehension, reasoning within the text, or reasoning beyond the text? The author's central theme. It's comprehension, right? It's the most basic level of question that you can get. This is a very common question, and you'd be surprised at how like annoying this kind of question can be if you don't get the correct what and how, right? So this one is very simple, and notice how regarding timing, right? Notice how some of these questions are a little bit more involved than the others, right? Reasoning within and reasoning beyond are a little bit more involved. Comprehensions are quick, right? You either know it or you don't. You either understand what the passage is or you don't understand what the passage is, right? So let's look. Opposing formal educational mandates. This doesn't seem like it's flowing too well with the central theme, right? Remember, we want something with talking about PE. We want talking about, choice in taking PE. Describing the consequences of making PE compulsory. Presenting reasons for why PE should not be compulsory. Advocating that PE be abolished in UK state schools. What do you guys think is the answer here? Don't include that question mark because you're right. Confidently just put that C, right? Don't second guess yourself. Second guessing yourself is going to kill you in this. If you second guess yourself all the time, it is really, really tough. It is really tough because when you have an answer, when you're stuck between two answers, second guessing yourself is the worst thing you do. You really have to be confident. You really have to, and obviously right now you're not going to have, I understand completely. Like right now you're just starting, you're not going to have that confidence, but once you build it up, you're gonna get that confidence. Do the passages get tricky? I'm so glad you asked, because we have a tricky passage coming up. So when it comes to trickiness, right? I think that the trickiness of the passage comes from how accessible it is to read the passage. So this passage is very accessible to read because it's written in modern, it's a modern problem, and it's like a modern parlance. It's a modern style of speaking, right? But sometimes you get like very dense art history or philosophical texts or something like that, right? So when it comes to very dense stuff, when it's harder to pull out the what and the how, then it's not that the questions suddenly become harder. It's that pulling out, reading, and interpreting the what and the how becomes harder. So yes, it's not as you go on, but some passages are harder than others. That's the best way to say it. There's actually an infamous AAMC practice passage that's about Picasso. And if you ask literally anybody who studied for cars and just mention like, oh, how'd you do on the Picasso passage? They will immediately understand what you're talking about. And they will they'll grimace and they'll be like, don't talk to me about the Picasso passage. So some of these passages are just way out there. And it's funny because when you guys actually sit down and you run into the passage, you will immediately know what I'm talking about. So look forward to that. Okay, yeah, so I'm pretty sure C is the right answer. Opposing formal educational mandates not related to PE, describing the consequence of making PE compulsory. That's not the central theme, right? That's like part of his agenda for exploring the central theme, which is it shouldn't be mandatory, right? So presenting reasons for why PE should not be compulsory, that seems really good. Advocating that PE be abolished in UK state schools. No, he's not. This is an extreme answer, right? This is an extreme answer. First of all, we don't like extreme answers because extreme answers are usually, I mean, I don't know how to say this. Like, if it's an extreme answer, it has to be really well justified. That's the best way to say it. So when you see an extreme answer, you're more on the side of like, I'm not too sure about this one. So it should be safe. Yeah, good. All right. Okay, so let's see what there's no, yeah, so it's only 4 questions this one. Usually it's not 4, usually it's like 5 or 6, but that's okay. So now, Do we have time to do another passage? I have another passage. Let's just go, you know what? Let's go through another passage because I want you guys to see like what a tricky one could look like. But let's just read it together so that we are able to get through it. Okay. Oh, wait. Let me give you the link as well. Okay. So, yeah, this is a much more dense passage, and I'm going to show you kind of how to break it down the way with highlighting the way that we were talking about. So, the rationalizing of society can be conceptualized as the pursuit of efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control through technology. But rational systems inevitably spawn a series of irrationalities that result in the compromising and perhaps even the undermining of their rationality. I've just read this and I really have no idea what this person is saying. And some passages are like that. Some passages are no, it's not 4. Actually, for some reason, they put 4 on these, but it's really supposed to be 5 to 7. Yeah, it's supposed to be 5 to 7. Yeah, so some of these passages, right, like, it's just like, what are you talking about, right? And you kind of just have to keep going and rather than for me, I guess it's different for everybody. For me, rather than like try to reread this and like try to hammer it out when I'm already stuck on it, I don't think it helps. I think it helps me to just keep reading and then kind of come back and like see if when I reread it again, like, do I get it a little bit more now? So he's talking about something about irrationalities and rationality, right? Okay. Fast food restaurants, which epitomize the rational model, prefer the fastest means of getting from a hungry state to a sated one, without surprises, at a low cost in a carnival-like setting, suggesting that fun awaits the consumer at each visit. The wholesomeness of the food seems an insignificant consideration. Whereas in the past, working people were prepared to spend up to an hour preparing dinner. They are now impatient if a meal is not on the table within 10 minutes. For their part, some fast food restaurants have developed chairs that become uncomfortable after about 20 minutes to ensure diners do not stay long. Fast food restaurants have preferentially recruited adolescent help, but at least until recently, because this age group adjusts more easily than adults do to surrendering their autonomy to machines, rules, and procedures. Few skills are required on the job, so workers are asked to use only a minute portion of their abilities. This policy is irrational from the standpoint of the organization, since it could obtain much more from its employees for the money, however negligible, that it pays them. These minimal skills demands are also irrational from the perspective of the employees, who are not allowed to think or respond creatively to the demands of the work. So now, in the first part, I really had no idea what he was talking about with rationality or irrationality. But now it seems like he's kind of sprinkling in some examples, okay? So I'll take examples. Maybe he's not going to tell me directly, right? This is what I mean by irrationality. Some authors will not do that. Remember that you're reading like an excerpt of something, right? So we see at the bottom here the citation, adapted from G. Ritzer, The McDonaldization of Society. So this is just a small portion of a whole book, right, about this concept. So we've just been dropped into the middle of it, right? And we're now trying to figure out as quickly as possible what's going on here, right? Like what is this, right? So we're going to take the clues that have been given to us, right? This policy is irrational from the standpoint of the organization since it could obtain much more from its employees for the money. So it seems that he's saying that the policy is irrational since it could obtain much more from the employees, but instead, the workers are only using a minute portion of their abilities. Okay, so that's something. And he's saying that it's also irrational that the employees are not allowed to think or respond creatively. Okay, so we have some little clues about what the heck irrationality means. These restrictions lead to high levels of resentment, job dissatisfaction, alienation, absenteeism, and turnover among workers in fast food franchises. In fact, these businesses have the highest turnover rate of any industry in the US. The entire workforce of the fast food industry turns over 3 times in a year. Although the simple, repetitive nature of the work makes it easy to replace those who leave, the organization would clearly benefit from keeping employees longer. The cost of hiring and training magnified when the turnover rate is extraordinarily high. The application of the rational model to the house building process in the 50s and 60s led to suburban communities consisting of nearly identical structures. So again, we get a clue. You're saying the rational models was applied to house building, and that led to nearly identical structures. Okay, so we get a little bit of a clue about what he means by rational. Indeed, it was possible to wander into the residence of someone else and to not realize immediately that one was not at home. The more expensive developments were superficially more diversified, but their interior layouts assumed residents who were indistinguishable in their requirements. So, residents who are indistinguishable. Again, we're getting all these little breadcrumbs of what he means. Furthermore, the planned communities themselves look very similar. Okay, so the communities also look similar. Established trees are bulldozed to facilitate construction. In their place, a number of saplings held up by posts and wire are planted. Streets are laid out in symmetrical grid patterns. With such uniformity, suburbanites may well enter the wrong subdivision or become lost on their own. So we get something about uniformity. Whoop. We get something about symmetrical, right? Many of Steven Spielberg's films are set in such suburbs. Spielberg's strategy is to lure the viewer into this highly repetitive world and then to have a completely unexpected event occur. So again, he's saying highly repetitive world, right? For example, the film Poltergeist takes place in a conventional suburban household in which evil spirits ultimately disrupt the sameness. The spirits first manifest themselves through another key element of the homogeneous society, the television set. Homogeneous society. The great success of Spielberg's films may be traceable to a longing for some unpredictability, even if it is bizarre and menacing in increasingly routinized lives. So, now, what the heck is this passage about, right? What is this dude talking about? So you'll notice that it's not as easy as the last passage. The last passage, the author was very forthcoming. The author was like, oh, this is what I believe. I don't think PE should be compulsory. Now, when it comes to this guy, we have to kind of dig out what he's talking about. What does he mean? What does he actually mean? So when it comes to a what and how, right? When it comes to a what and how does the author feel about it? The what is this concept of rational and irrational, right? He's saying, and we kind of were able to explore what he meant by that, right? When we looked at rational, right, what were some of the keywords that he said about rational models? Identical structures, indistinguishable, uniform, symmetrical, highly repetitive. So it seems like a rational model is very standardized. It's very like lacking uniqueness. Everything is uniform, right? And what did he say about irrationality? He said that irrationality is stuff like, the workers are paid, but not to their full extent, right? So he's saying this is irrational because they're not allowed to use their creativity. They're not allowed to. So in a nutshell, we can kind of say that for a what, right? For a what, we can say rational world is uniform. As just a very basic, simple what. And now we kind of need a how. And this is kind of tricky because the author didn't outright say, this is how I feel about it, right? But let's look. At the very beginning, right? We had no idea what this first paragraph was about. But now it says, the rationalizing of society can be conceptualized as a pursuit of efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control through technology. Oh, now that I've looked at those examples, I get what he means by predictability, calculability, and control through technology. He's saying that a rational world is very predictable, right? Rationalization of society is turning everything predictable for the sake of efficiency. But rational systems inevitably spawn a series of irrationality that result in the compromising and perhaps even the undermining of the rationality. That's kind of, he's low-key saying what he feels. He's saying that the rationality may lead to irrationality. That's ultimately what I can pull out from this passage right now. So now we can dig into the questions a little bit. So the first question is, the author's argument suggests that the primary motive of employers who make humans work with machines is to what? So we have here, improve the quality of their products, right? Was he saying that, so improving the quality of the products, does that make sense with the rational world as uniform, right? So that's kind of what we have to look into, right? And he says, I don't think that's correct, because he says the wholesomeness of the food seems an insignificant consideration. He's saying that, we're all doing it fast. They're just working really fast, and they're not, all they're doing is making the fastest meals possible with a low cost, right? And not that we're working to make the best food possible. So it doesn't seem that the primary motive of employers to make humans work with machines. And when we're saying humans work with machines, that tells us that it's a rational employer, right? Because they're saying control through technology. And they're saying that surrendering their autonomy to machines, rules, and procedures. So you can see that there are little hints sprinkled throughout that are cluing you in. So if it's an employer who makes humans work with machines, then they're a rational employer. If they're a rational employer, they're making everything uniform, right? Improve the quality of the products? Nah, you're not trying to improve the quality of products. You're just driving you're just selling as much food as possible, as quickly as possible. Reduce the cost of wages and benefits. Now, it does say, for the money, however negligible, it pays them, right? That's true, right? This so far is true. The author's argument suggests that the primary motive of employers who make humans work with machines, the primary motive. Now, again, this is when we stuck at a tough one, right? We need to link it back to our main idea. Is reducing the cost of wages and benefits something that they talked about with rationality? And I did not see that they were specifically talking about, doing this for the sake of doing this the rational model is about driving costs down. What do we see with the rational model? We see nearly identical. We see very similar. We see symmetrical. We see uniform. We see highly repetitive. Not much about reducing the cost. It may be that that's a possibility, right? But it's not the primary reason, primary motive. Avoid seeming to be behind the times. I'm not really sure what this was referring to. I don't think that this was there talked about at all. So that's also something that happens. Sometimes they just throw something in that wasn't talked about at all. So yeah. Increase the uniformity of the procedures. So breaking them down one by one is, because I'm teaching you guys now, I'm doing that one by one. But if you kind of go through all these one by one and you see, oh, wait a minute, uniformity. That's exactly what it's about, right? So that kind of helps you to find, to kind of hone in on the answer more. So yeah, so what we did was we went through the passage, we extracted the meaning of the rational world, right? And then we came to this idea that the rational world is uniform, and then D just gives it to us. Increase the uniformity of procedures. So it should be D. So this is a comprehension question, and Yeah. In the third paragraph, the author cites employer preference to hire employees that are comfortable with surrendering their autonomy to machines, rules, and procedures. This is consistent with the claim that the employer has uniformity of procedures as a goal. So that's that. Now, a common thread in the discussion of fast food and the discussion of suburban, and also if you have a question, just post in the chat whenever. A common thread in the discussion of fast food and the discussion of suburban housing is that people today are increasingly resistant to the regimentation of life, expect their needs to be met at the lowest possible cost, allow themselves to be treated as interchangeable, are unable to discriminate among products that differ in quality. Well, increasingly resistant, we have to think about, what flows with what has been talked about so far, right? Are the people increasingly resistant to the regimentation of life? If we think of regimentation of life as uniformity, as rationalization, right? He said that this age group adjusts more easily than adults do. So it's not that they're increasingly resistant, but that they're increasingly vulnerable. So this is actually a straight contradiction. B, expect their needs to be met at the lowest possible cost. Well, this is true for the fast food, right? He does say that prefer at a low cost. Well, actually, it doesn't say at the lowest possible cost. So, oh, okay. So for A, a common thread in the discussion of fast food and the discussion of suburban housing. So there was in the top, there was talking about fast food, and then at the bottom, they talked about housing, right? And they're saying people today are increasingly resistant to the regimentation of life. So regimentation is like locking us down to how do I explain it? Locking us regimentation, right? Like if you're in prison, your life is regimented. You have a schedule that you have to follow all the time. So regimentation that's what regimentation means. So this is increasingly resistant to the regimentation of life. But they wouldn't be increasingly resistant. He's saying that actually they more easily surrender their autonomy to rules and procedures. So that would imply that they're becoming more regimented. They're just following orders all the time. Okay. So does that help? Okay, cool. So what was I looking at? Oh yeah. So expect their needs to be met at the lowest possible cost. The problem that I have with this is I don't remember anything being talked about with cost for the housing discussion, right? So remember that if they don't talk about it, that's also bad, right? Contradictions are very easy to spot, but lack of evidence is also a problem, right? So I don't see, he talks a lot about the uniformity of the houses, but I didn't see anything about the low cost of the houses. Otherwise, I would have picked that one, but I don't see anything about that. C, allow themselves to be treated as interchangeable. Ooh, I like this one. Why do I like this one? Their interior layout assumed residents who were indistinguishable. Indistinguishable and interchangeable are the same thing, right? That's nice. And when we talked, he had a whole discussion about how the employees get turned over, right? The simple, repetitive nature of the work makes it easy to replace those who leave, right? And notice how we have a beautiful connection here. Simple, repetitive nature, highly repetitive world. Oof, perfect, right? That's exactly the common thread that we're looking for, right? Allow themselves to be, but it's linked in a weird way. Allow themselves to be treated as interchangeable. You have to do a little bit of work to find in the passage where they said that they're being treated as interchangeable, but it's there, and it links in terms of the logic. So C seems pretty good. D, are unable to discriminate among products that differ in quality. The The problem is I don't see anything about discriminating between differing quality products. So I don't think that this is correct. And C just seems incredibly correct. Yeah. So no discussion of consumers expecting their needs to be met at the lowest possible cost, either with respect to fast food or suburban housing. Oh, okay. So it's definitely not for suburban housing. I thought that maybe because they said low cost here, but they weren't saying lowest cost, right? So, like, okay, that sometimes that's what it is. So option C is correct. Good. Seems like you guys are getting the hang of this. Okay. 3 or 4. Information in the passage suggests that a rationalized travel agency would emphasize, right? Okay, so we've got planned tours to popular attractions with accommodations at large hotels, computerized systems to provide low-cost customized itineraries, personnel trained to make reservations but with little experience as travelers, procedures that encourage problem-solving initiatives by managers. So we've done a couple of questions at this point. What do you guys think is the answer here? Just take a minute to look over this and drop an answer that you think makes sense. Oh, interesting. We have a contradiction in the chat. That's fun. So that's fun. So Sophia, why do you think A can be canceled?
I was thinking that B, C, and D are more like expand on each other about like similarity and uniformity, and I thought A was out because it doesn't really speak about that uniformity system.
Got it. Right. So it's not speaking on our what, on our main idea, right? Okay, good. Genesis, why do you think it's A?
I honestly think it's A because I was reading over the different responses and I don't think it seemed correct based on the passage and what the passage was about. So I'm like, A has to be the one because, like, for example, B talks about low cost and I don't know, I don't know if I'm explaining it correctly. I just felt that it was A.
Okay, cool. So I'm very happy that you guys are, really engaging and thinking about these things, right? A, plan tours to popular attractions with accommodations at large hotels. This is so when they're saying a rationalized travel agency, like Sophia was saying, right? It has to be rational, it has to be uniform, it has to be standardized, right? A doesn't seem to really be strongly on that sense, but also large hotels, like if you've been to large hotels, right? They're all the same. So it's like, I could see, I don't feel like there's anything necessarily wrong with this, but I'm also not excited by this choice, right? That sometimes that happens, right? Right now, I don't want to cancel this out because I don't see anything wrong with it, right? It's true that they're not directly referencing uniformity, but there's also not a blatant contradiction. So for now, I would only straight up cancel out blatant contradictions, blatant like you went against uniformity, right? I would only cancel those out. So for now, we'll just leave it. B, computerized systems to provide low-cost customized itineraries. Computerized systems, machines, technology, that's good. Low cost, like low cost food, hey, that's good. Customized itineraries. Is this answer choice correct? Why is this wrong? It's not the same, right? Customized itineraries. Oof, this is a terrible, just because of one word. If it was computerized systems to provide low-cost standardized itineraries, oof, that's a perfect answer. That's a perfect answer. But since it's customized because of one word, you've outright contradicted. B is out. C, personnel trained to make reservations but with little experience as travelers. Personnel trained to make reservations but with little experience as travelers. Interesting. I'm not sure what the point of this is. Personnel trained to make reservations, but with little experience as travelers. I feel like this but with little experience as travelers is kind of like what we saw in last question, where it's just like, it's just there, but we never talked about this at all. Like with fast food workers, they never said anything about the fast food workers also have a background in like fast food working. Yeah, no, because it doesn't make sense. Sometimes there are some that just don't make sense. And you're like, did we even talk about this? No, I don't think we actually did talk about this. So it seems like this is like what you could call out of scope, out of the scope of the passage, not really discussed in the passage. D, procedures that encourage problem-solving initiatives by managers. Okay, so this one is a blatant contradiction because these minimal skills demands are also irrational from the perspective of the employees who are not allowed to think or respond creatively to the demands of the work, right? Procedures that encourage problem-solving initiatives. Initiative is, an employee doing their thing on their own, the manager doing the thing on their own, but that's against rationalization, where everybody is doing the same exact thing and everything is standardized, right? The employees would not be problem solving because they're not allowed to respond creatively. So therefore, even though A is kind of a weird answer, it ends up being the only one that's not a contradiction, right? Customize is a contradiction. Little experience as travelers has no basis in the passage, and problem-solving initiatives is contradicted by rationalization. So it ends up being that planned tours to popular attractions, okay, popular could be interpreted as rational. Accommodation at large hotels. Large hotel chains are like, I guess what they're saying is that those are standardized and those are rationals, like the houses that they talked about. So yeah. So the big lesson to take away from here is that don't get rely on elimination very heavily, because the answer choice that's right will never scream out, oh, I'm right, pick me, I'm right. It will always be kind of reluctant. It will always be like I guess this has to be the right choice. That's kind of the approach that you can go for. So yeah, any questions about this one? This is a tough one. We can see only 46% of people got it right. But if you understand how we were able to get to this, understanding the logic is the first step to be able to replicate that logic on your own, right? So it's a tough one, but you can definitely do this. You can definitely do this. Just one step at a time. You make your what and your how, and you compare each choice to the what and the how, and you go. And don't be too trigger happy. Yeah. I chose A because it was the only one that seemed like it couldn't be it using reverse psychology. Okay, that's really funny. Wow, that's really funny. If you just purposely chose, like, I think this is the most wrong, so it's got to be right. That's really funny. Imagine if you just like purposely mistrained yourself and then like, this definitely seems right, so it's got to be wrong. Oh, that's funny. That's pretty funny. I don't know how well that would work out in the long term, but it worked out here. Okay. Okay. All right. Last one. So suppose that employee responses to working conditions on fast food franchises in paragraph 4 also apply, so paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, also apply to entry-level assembly line workers. In light of this information, the author's main point in mentioning these responses. So employee responses to working conditions in fast food franchises. Oh, so the employee responses were here, right? High levels of resentment, job dissatisfaction, and all that good stuff, right? In fast food. So he's saying, suppose that this also applies to entry-level assembly line workers, right? In light of this info, the author's main point is, mentioning these responses is, weakened. Okay, so first of all, when you have something like this, you have to decide, is it weakened or is it strengthened, right? Before you even dig into the weeds, right? Is it weakened or is it strengthened? So he's saying the choice is, the question is saying, the employee response of job dissatisfaction also applies to assembly line workers. So is the main point in mentioning those responses weakened or strengthened? Well, ultimately, this is just asking, are assembly line workers similar to the fast food workers, right? And it seems that they would be because of the simple, repetitive nature of the work, right? So it should be strengthened. I agree, right? Because they're saying, suppose these responses apply to these guys, and since these guys are also engaging in simple, repetitive nature of the work, that seems like it's strengthening the author's point. And now the reason is why. Since predictability and employee turnover are associated in other contexts, or since low wages and job dissatisfaction are associated in other contexts. Well, which of these flows better with our main idea? Which of these represents our what and our how? Is it C or is it D? C, right? Strengthened since predictability and employee turnover are associated in other contexts, right? So we have the employee turnover linking to the dissatisfaction, and then we also have the predictability linking to our synopsis. Rational worlds are uniform. Rational worlds are predictable, symmetrical, whatever, right? And remember, we already saw that low wages and job dissatisfaction. Low wages was not an aspect of uniformity and rationality. Good. So it seems like everybody got that. So that's awesome. So that's the last question. Okay. So how did you guys feel about that? A little bit of cars practice. A little dipping our toes into the pool. Awesome. Awesome. Very good. So I'm gonna just tell you briefly about some future steps when you get into your own cars practice, right? Some things that may pop up that you want to address or think about, right? If you're consistently getting questions wrong, that means you're having a comprehension issue, right? If you're having, well, no, it doesn't. Sorry. Let me rephrase. If you're consistently getting questions wrong, you're having an issue. It could be a comprehension issue or it could be a timing issue. So if it's a comprehension issue, how do you figure out which one it is? If you do a passage with unlimited time, that'll tell you. Because think about it. Maybe you get a passage wrong in 10 minutes, right? Maybe you get like 4 questions wrong. Well, would you have also gotten those 4 questions wrong if you had an hour to do the passage, right? Think about it. And if you can't get it right in an hour, what hope do you have to get it right in 10 minutes? None, right? So if you're having problems, right, with questions, you might want to take a step back and say, okay, hold on. Let me just devote an hour to this one passage and let me think through everything and see if I can appropriately get the logic, right? And if you can't, that tells you that you need to forget about timing, right? For the present, forget about timing for now and work on that comprehension. Work on writing out those logic, work on, being concise with your logic and not making assumptions and not falling for those subtle wrong choices, right? If you're consistently running out of time, right, you're getting choices correct, but you're just running out of time, right? You have to look at where your timing is going bad. Are you spending more than 4 or 5 minutes on the passage? That's too slow, right? That's usually going to be too slow. You're going to have to either, practice reading a little faster or practice reading in a more engaged way, right? If you're spending too much time on the questions, like I said, 1 minute, boom, move on. 1 minute, flag and move on. If If you're stuck on a question for more than a minute, it's not going to help you to keep rehashing that question. If you're confused, one of the things that really, really helps me, I remember I talked about that idea of being a criminal investigator. And this was my mental framework for when I got bored of cars, right? Because you're going to get bored. You're going to get bored. You're going to be reading and you're going to be like, what? Why do I care about 16th century like Venetian statues? Why am I doing this? Oh my God, this is like mind numbing, right? When that happens, you need to put yourself in a mental framework of, oh my God, this is the most interesting thing I've ever read in my life. I'm so excited to be reading this. Oh my God, this is so interesting. I want to know about this author, right? And so for me, that framework was, I'm a detective and I'm investigating this criminal and I'm trying to find out as much as I can about them, right? I've heard other frameworks. Some people pretend like they have a gun to their head and they're reading for like their lives and that helps them. Some people are like, whatever kind of mental framework that like, that's not what I'm recommending, right? That might be a little, I think that person was a particular kind of person. I think that might be stressful for most people. I think make your own mental framework that helps you really engage. Like maybe you're reading to somebody and you want them to really know about it. Maybe you're maybe like the same kind of feelings that you have when you run into a topic that you're actually interested in, right? And you're like, oh, this is actually cool. I want to read this, right? Try to grab that and emulate it for all topics because you kind of have to fake it until you're making it and you're just feeling like, oh yeah, I'm excited to read about Michelangelo the artist. Like, yeah, let's read about that. So yeah, so that's all of my tips for cars. That's just the beginning. And that's going to be it for the car session.